Hello and welcome to another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. I'm your host for today, Jeremy Sporn. We let John take yet another episode off. I know. Very nice of us. But I was able to get a chance to listen to the conversation John Very had with John Ellis. John Ellis is yet another person we have spoken to who is heavily involved in the creation, implementation, monitoring, and continuous improvement of CMMC that is just extremely impressive. He is the DCMA's Director of Software, 30-year Army vet, experienced auditor, self-proclaimed geek, and in my very humble opinion, there really might not be anyone else in the world who understands the DFARS 7012 clause or even NIST 800-171 better than John Ellis. Listening to John and John riff on this stuff was super cool. You know, if you know that a CMMC audit is in your future, there is no one better to give you a glimpse into what that future audit will look like. John Ellis has conducted NIST 800-171 audits himself. And has helped lead a team that does that work also. He is super plugged into the details of the transition to CMMC. There's just no better source than John for practical advice on how to be ready for your CMMC audit. As a quick teaser as well, John Ellis clarifies a hotly debated subject of how CMMC Level 3 certified orgs will need to manage their supply chain risk. You do not want to miss this. Let's get to the show.
John, good afternoon, sir. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Cool. So I always like to start super simple. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do?
So I'm John Ellis. I'm DCMA's Director for Software. I am also the guy responsible from an agency perspective for coordinating cybersecurity policy amongst the DIB and across the contracts that DCMA manages on behalf of the department. I'm a retired Army officer. I was in for 30 years, a former 06 level commander. I was an acquisition professional for approximately 20 years of my 30-year stint, and have been with DCMA in this current capacity since January of 2016.
Cool. Thank you. So before we get down to business, I always like to ask you, what's your drink of choice?
Beer.
All beer, or you're an IPA guy, you a stout guy? Where do you fall?
So I'm a lager/pilsner kind of guy.
So Pilsner Urquell?
Yep. I've had it. Enjoy it.
That's a great one. What's your favorite?
My favorite beer is from a little place in Germany from when I used to live there that you can't get in the United States. It's called Zerndorfer. And they've been making the same beer in the same place since the 1600s. It's the same recipe.
Oh, that's cool.
And I miss that kind of good beer in Germany.
How have you been back just to have a beer? I mean, because if it's that good, it's one of those places that might actually be worth visiting just for a beer, right?
I will never admit such a thing.
All right. So let's get down to business. So, you threw out a couple buzzwords there that people might not be familiar with. So do me a favor real quick. What is the DCMA? And then what is the DIBCAC?
So the Defense Contract Management Agency is a fourth estate agency that has the responsibility of managing a certain subset of, if you will, of major defense contracts on behalf of the Department of Defense. So contracts get delegated to DCMA, not all contracts. And those contracts, we serve the other services and agencies to ensure that those contractual contractual requirements are met, and that the companies actually provide the things that are required to the warfighter and meet requirements and standards. The DIBCAC, the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, is an organization we formed a little more than a year ago to perform the DoD standard methodology assessments that everybody knows that came out of the Miss Ward memos from last year.
Gotcha.
There were actually a series of memos The latest one from November describes the methodology. It was shared with industry, and DCMA has the responsibility of performing the assessments outlined in that document, as well as training and coordinating with the other services and agencies for consistency across the DoD workforce.
Gotcha. So I know the scale of the DCMA is huge. And anyone listening probably has no idea. It's one of those, I didn't know who the DCMA was until I started doing work at the DIB. How big is the DCMA in terms of dollars, in terms of contracts? I mean, because give people some perspective, because it's a lot bigger than most people probably think.
So it's an interesting measure. It depends how you look at it. So DCMA is around 12,000 personnel. We're located literally around the globe. We manage, depending on how you do the math, somewhere around $8 trillion in contracts. But we don't actually administer all contracts for the Department of Defense. The DIB, if you will, the Defense Industrial Base, is considered a roughly 300,000 plus or minus companies. DCMA only administers contracts with somewhere in the 16,000 range. So there are a lot of companies out there that DCMA does not have a relationship with. The other thing is we typically only interact with prime contractors.
Gotcha.
From a contract administration perspective, that doesn't mean we don't also work with companies that happen to be subs at some times, because often subs are primes are subs, depending on the relationship of a particular contractual mechanism. But DCMA administers those delegated contracts from the services and agencies to perform those functions on their behalf. A notable area that we don't do is Navy shipbuilding, for example. However, we work very closely with the Navy to support their lead, if you will, in that regard.
Gotcha. So I know that the DIBCAC's, original DIBCAC, if I remember correctly, was started about a year ago, correct? And I know their original charge was to, quote unquote, ensure contractor compliance and safeguarding information about the weapons, equipment, and systems they build. So I know in practicality, right, DIBCAC largely does what I would think of as being NIST SP 800-171, auditing verification. Do they do anything beyond that?
No. Their sole purpose, well, let me take that back. From a mission execution perspective, they do focus on performing the 800-171 assessments that the 7012 requires.
Gotcha.
However, they also train other services and agencies to ensure that those elements within, whether it's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, MDA, so that their assessors are consistent with the methodology and can perform, a consistent operation across DoD boundaries. So our guys actually train the other services and agencies to a large extent to ensure that consistency.
Gotcha. So when I chat with people, there's this some misconception that if you already have a contract that includes FAR 7012 and you're not going to bid anything else, until 2025 that requires CMMC, that you really have nothing to do for the next 5 years from a security perspective. I think your entity is the reason why that's not really quite true, right? I mean, organizations, if they've got an existing contract, they really need to be demonstrably compliant with 800-171, correct?
Absolutely. So this question comes up fairly often, and it's interesting because the 7012 clause has been around for a while. It's on well over 1 million contracts.
Wow.
It's a mandatory requirement for practically everything that we do, with the exception of pure COTS contracts. So 7012 does not go away, and that need to implement 800-171 level of requirements does not go away while we wait for CMMC to come along. The beautiful thing is, at the core of CMMC, particularly for those companies that will need to achieve CMMC level 3, it's the same 800-171 standard between the current requirements and what the CMMC level 3 requirements are going to dictate, in addition to those additional process and maturity oriented requirements that fall under CMMC.
Right.
So the work you do today builds on the work you're going to do in the future.
Right. Yeah. I mean, practically, and you could argue that 871 is about 85% or so of CMMC level 3, right?
Yep.
It's 110 out of the 130 controls. And then I know that the processes, people make a big deal out of those as being an additional 51 characteristics. But if you were implementing 871 right, most of those processes, if not all those processes, are going to be there anyway, right? And that would be something
Right.
you'd almost be looking at anyway. Cool.
Yeah, it's going to be very similar between the two, requirement sets if it gets right down to it. And for those companies that have fully implemented, they're not going to have an issue transitioning to those a couple additional things that's required under CMMC level 3. That's
right.
assuming they actually eat their own dog food, do the things that they say they are doing in the full implementation of 80171.
Mm-hmm. But that's the DIBCAC's job is you're the guys that go out and make sure that they actually are doing what they said they were going to do.
Yes.
So what is what's the audit scope, call it extent, call it rigor of a typical 80171 review that's done by the DIBCAC?
So I'm going to keep it in pretty broad general terms.
Mm-hmm.
A coordination for an assessment starts anywhere from 30 to 45 days prior to the assessment. The associated contracting officer will reach out to the intended company and ask to participate in an assessment with DCMA. Once the company says yes, there will be some meetings to talk about preparations, the types of documents, sort of the administrative coordination prior to the actual event. It's one of the key things to point out with the assessment. We understand that system security plans, one of the key elements of an assessment, can be very sensitive. Mm-hmm. So up prior to the COVID-19 impacts that we're currently facing, and we can address that separately if you'd like, we were very careful not to ask companies to send SSPs to us. We would actually ask that those be made available to us when our assessors showed up on site. The week of the assessment typically starts on a Monday. The assessment takes place by starting with an in-brief, followed by a careful document review. So for those companies that have not been through a DIBCAC assessment or one with the other services and agencies following the same methodology, I want to let you know, if you give us documentation, we will review your documentation, which does come in handy when you're not sure where the policy may be, because our guys will help you find it. But at the end of the day, at the end of that first day, that first day is all about preparation. The real assessment begins on the Tuesday morning. Typically, it's scheduled to go through Friday. The length of the assessment really depends on how well the company is prepared, how well they know how to touch all the things that need to be touched, and have the personnel available to demonstrate the things that have to be demonstrated. We've seen assessments go as fast as 1.5 days. We've seen them take the full week to get it done. The weekend generally ends with an out brief. During the out brief, there are no surprises. It's a complete open kimono sort of assessment. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that each day there's a hot wash between the assessors and the company to ensure, answer any questions, look for any do outs that may be, part of the assessment of missing document, missing artifact, something that's needed to demonstrate that a requirement is being met. So there's no mystery involved in the entire process. It's very transparent. It's very collegial. It's not intended to be a gotcha. In fact, we prefer it if companies are fully compliant with the things they're supposed to be compliant with. We're not there to rain on anybody's parade and tell anybody that they're not, doing good things for the nation.
Right.
Our intent is to ensure that the company's doing the things that it's supposed to do. At the end of the week, there's an out brief that goes over the tentative score, so that that all that is shared very, very directly with the company. And then in the event that it's needed, there's a reclama period. There's just some artifact, some document, some piece of work that was not able to be accomplished during the review, and that can take up to 30 days after the assessment to clear those items. Dot those I's and cross those T's. The final report is shared back to the company. approximately 30 to 45 days later. And those scores, once they're settled, get entered into the supplier performance risk system SPRS, a website that's laid out in the Miss Lord November 19 memo that the government can use to share the scoring information across the Department of Defense.
Gotcha. So in terms of like, if indeed you've got, let's call it a finding, I don't know what you guys would refer to it as, would there be an expectation that they would produce a POAM to address that any particular issues that you did identify?
So during the conduct of the assessment, we're actually expecting to see the POAMs identified via the company's self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the preparation for an assessment is for the company to perform a self-assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And in any areas where they believe they have not fully implemented a requirement, they should have a POAM to demonstrate that they're aware of the issue and they understand the scope and the magnitude of what they need to do to get it right.
Right. But if you identify something that they're still doing wrong during your audit, how do they address that? Is that through a POAM?
So it would be through a POAM.
Okay.
But technically at that point, so here's when we get into the DFARZs of an assessment. So under the current DFARS rule, what is required is a system security plan and a POAM for any deficient areas. So if a company has a SSP and actually has POAMs for the things they may not have implemented fully, then they're actually compliant with the DFARS clause. They may not receive full scoring credit, obviously.
Okay, that's how you handle it.
So we adjudicate it there, but every now and then we find where a company just got it wrong. And in that case, that would be a deficiency, and we allow the company to either get the POAM together while we're on site or get it to us during the reclama period. That's usually what happens sometime in that time frame. Any deficient POAMs are identified and put together. In the few cases where that's not been the case, that's when you start getting into what DCMA calls a corrective action request, which is an administrative procedure that a contracting officer notifies the contractor that you're deficient in a particular area and now you got to fix it.
Gotcha. Now, the one thing you said right at the very beginning of that, you said when they say yes or if they say yes, you almost implied that they had a choice. If DIBCAC says we want to come visit you, can somebody say no?
Yes.
Really? Oh.
They can. Now, I would ask that
you wouldn't recommend it.
I wouldn't recommend it, but we typically have a reason for why we want to visit particular companies. So from a DoD prioritization perspective, I talked a minute ago about how many companies DCMA administers contracts with, and it's that 16,000. Obviously, we don't have the resources to go assess all of them. So we use DoD priorities to pick and choose the companies that do the work that we're most interested in. And if you're one of those companies, you tend to know that you are one of those companies.
Gotcha.
So those companies, when we send out an invitation, we're wanting to go there for a reason, and it's generally because of a DoD priority.
Gotcha.
So saying no just means we're going to come back later when it may not be optional.
Okay, and then that DoD priority, I'm assuming that's sort of like a special sauce, right? You're like you said, you're going to do a sampling of entities. It's going to be based on some internal prioritization. Someone can't figure out if they're going to get audited, correct?
I mean, if you're a company that's working on a major ACAP program, or you're working on those sorts of technologies that have national interest, chances are you're going to see
Gotcha.
a DCMA assessment in your future if you haven't already seen one.
Gotcha.
And I think it's really important to understand that those companies generally know who they are.
Right.
Now, if you're making bootlaces or galvanized steel washers, typically we're probably not showing up.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that we won't. I mean, we've had a couple of instances where small companies had reported cyber incidents, and we actually asked those companies to work with us as a follow-on to see what progress they had made. In particular, there was a small company in the Midwest that had a reported incident, They had spent a lot of money to try to shore up their defenses. And quite honestly, we wanted to get a feel for how well they had spent that money, just to see, sort of do a check of the pulse, if you will, of what's going on in the defense industrial base. What we found was sort of a mixed bag. Some of the advice they had gotten was pretty good. Some of it was not so good. But that's consistent with, any consultancy, any service that companies can acquire, in the conduct of their business.
Right. Yeah. Listen, I mean, it's like anything else, right? 50% of the doctors finish in the bottom half of their class. You could make the same argument for consultants as well.
Yes.
Cool. So quick question on that. So we talked about 800-171 review. Do you guys, there are some additional requirements, if you will, if you look at the full DFAR clause, 7102. So when you're going out, are you looking at the DFAR clause, which includes 800-171 or just 800-171?
So the emphasis of the assessment is on the implementation of those 110 requirements that are laid out in 800-171. So and this is part of the good part of the assessment methodology. If you go look at that November 2019 memo that Ms. Lord put out, it seems like forever ago, but it was only November, it basically lays out the entire assessment. If you want to know how the homework is going to be graded, all you have to do is go look at the 800-171 alpha assessment guide that goes with 800-171.
Right.
So not only do we tell you what we're going to look at, but we tell you how we're going to grade you by going through the assessment guide. There's no mystery. There's no vague references of any sort. Of course, being able to report an incident, which is a 7012 requirement, that's actually part of the assessment methodology if you want to get right down to it. But for the most part, it really does focus on the technical implementation of those requirements defined by 800-171.
Cool. Because, and the reason I asked that is that one of the things that I've seen a misconception, I wonder if you could comment on. I know you're not a CMMC, that's not your job, CMMC, but you guys are, tip of the spear, if you will, in terms of doing these audits. The DFAR 7012 clause includes that, includes in, I think it's clause M, where it obligates them to include that clause and the requirement to protect CUI in accordance with the DFAR requirement, which includes 800-171 for their subcontractors, right? Or at least their primary, the first level of subcontractor. So one of the things I've seen is people look at CMMC, and if you look at the supply chain requirement, it doesn't happen to level 4. So I've had clients actually say to me, like, I don't need to worry about vendor risk management. And to me, that's illogical, right? I mean, it would make no sense that I would hold my you to CMMC level 3, but then you'd have unfettered ability to hand that CUI to somebody else and not have any attestation that they're doing the right thing with it. Am I reading those tea leaves right from your perspective?
So yes. So, but there is some ambiguity, and I understand where it's coming from. So let me try to clarify it. So under the current construct, the DIBCAC does not look at that particular flow down of requirements that you're referring to. There is guidance, however, for those companies that are subject to purchasing system reviews. Purchasing system reviews do require that 7012 be flowed down to the first tier of suppliers, and that the primes gather information, some sort of self-attestation or attestation document. It could be even using the results that a company has performed a self-assessment of themselves if they have not had not undergone a DIBCAC assessment. But there is part of the flow down process is to look for evidence that the first tier supplier meets 800-171 requirements. So there is a flow down aspect of 7012. The DIBCAC works closely with the purchasing system review folks that look at that, but the DIBCAC themselves do not do that flow down assessment. So it's a different part of DCMA that does the purchasing system reviews. But our guys work closely with them to ensure consistency across the mission areas. That will not change. That should not change as 7012 goes forward. Eventually CMMC will come out of rulemaking. Any revisions to 7012 that may or may not happen, I would assume, will account for that.
Okay.
But there will be a flow down requirement. And quite honestly, companies should want to know about the other companies they do business with to ensure that not only is the government's information protected, but any of that proprietary information from the prime to the sub would be protected as well. It's the same networks and systems that all that information resides in. So there is a vested interest, if you're a prime, that the subs that you're going to use, your suppliers, can actually protect the information that you share with them, whether or not it's the government's information or not.
Right. And that same, just to be clear, because a lot of the people that would probably be listening to this are not going to be primes. They're going to be subcontractors to the primes. That subcontractor is going to have that, should logically have that same level of obligation, that their first level of people that they're contracting with, need to treat this CUI, to the same level that they're treating it to, correct?
Absolutely.
Cool. It just made so much. And even if you think about it, right, and I think there's even an indirect obligation, right? Because we have the concept of a risk assessment. And if I looked at a risk assessment, that risk assessment didn't consider third-party risk, I would question whether or not they did a good risk assessment. So now I have a third-party risk. If I didn't cover that adequately, then I didn't achieve the standard either. So I do think that there's, like people say there's no explicit supply chain, and I agree with that. But I think there's an implicit when you look at the risk assessment requirement anyway.
I agree. I will tell you that when we first started doing the assessments last summer, particularly during the pilot phase, we did have some out of assessment conversations with particularly some of the big primes to understand how they vetted suppliers. Because quite honestly, the supply chain issue is a rather sensitive subject. A couple things we learned in that discussion. A lot of primes, they have a lot of supply chain insight, sometimes only 4, 5, 6 levels deep, when we all know that the chain runs much deeper than that. That's a concern.
Really? It runs, you think it actually runs that many levels deep?
Sometimes.
Wow.
And in other cases, some companies have very robust supply chain assessment mechanisms where others really don't. And it really depends on the company and how much risk assessment and how much work they put into it, because it is a large undertaking. If you go and look at particularly anything that's command control related, where do all the components for computers and circuit boards and those integrated circuits come from? They typically don't come from the U.S. And those parts are buried so far deep in a supply chain as the individual components get added to devices, and it rolls all the way up to eventually show up on the it's on the deck of a ship, or it's it's in the back of an armored command post, or it's flying around in an airborne command post. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes from a lot of interesting places. And companies do not always have full insight into where all of that stuff came from.
Yeah, it's interesting you should point that out, because I think this morning there was a big article that came out where I believe it was somebody in that DoD hierarchy, if you will, was suggesting that America needs to do a better job of maintaining, its manufacturing of those levels of components that are going into the, its supply chain. So your timing on that comment was pretty interesting, given what I read this morning on it. So, you guys are, the experts, I would say, right, in terms of auditing against 800-171. I would assume it's logical to assume that you guys have been working with the CMMC AB, to help them kind of, put their thoughts together about how they're going to do the audits?
Yes, so DCMA has been involved in the establishment of CMMC since day one. One of the things that we've been very cognizant of was that as we went through the assessment process and figured out how to really work through the methodology and how to improve it as we went along, we modified our training along the way to ensure that we actually applied those lessons learned. I know that's a radical thing to say in the government, but we really did endeavor to do that, and we believe we've done a pretty good job. So as CMMC has been standing up, we wanted to ensure that they had the benefit of all of that training, all of those lessons learned, all of those hard knocks that we had to figure out the hard way in some way. So our DIBCAC is very much a part of that development team on the CMMC side of things to ensure that there's that training leverages what we have put together, including the actual assessment methodology itself. So there is a ton of collaboration. DCMA has been involved in all aspects of the training, in aspects of the mock assessments, and all of those activities that will eventually lead up to the full implementation of CMMC.
I'm starting to melt. I came into the office today and I'm sitting here and I closed my eyes. I just realized that the AC must not be on. So all of a sudden I feel like, like, man, it suddenly got hot here.
Don't start having hot flashes, man. I can't help you.
So obviously with 80171, being a viable and important standard until full CMMC rollout, I assume that DIBCAC is going to continue to execute these 80171 assessments for the next, let's say 5 years or plus. I mean, what is that the plan at this point?
I mean, we are going to continue to conduct assessments up until some transition period. Mm-hmm. So until CMMC is kind of up and running, we will continue to perform, those standard methodology assessments. That is still the requirement. Mm-hmm. Once the rules, assuming those rules change and we actually get CMMC up and running, there will be a transition. Now, one of the things I want to make sure folks understand, though, is that CMMC is not going to do away with the government assessing programs. So yes, there will be CMMC assessments, but if you guys recall, prior to the standard assessment methodology we started last year, the whole 800-171 7012 clause was based on a trust me model. Mm-hmm. Nobody was really looking. There was a few folks looking here and there. The Navy in particular was doing a good job of assessing compliance with the cyber requirements. But quite honestly, there was a lack of consistency across the board, and there was a lack of government involvement. And, we've all seen the press. We all are aware of some of the incidents that occurred, so we don't need to go into that. Even once CMMC rolls out, we the government will maintain an ability to independently assess things that are of sufficient priority or of specific, particular interest to the government. I think that's a good, honest broker approach to ensuring that we're all on the same sheet of music in terms of priorities and importance of why CMMC and the 7012 requirements are there. So there will be assessments that are outside of CMMC based on those DoD priorities.
Gotcha. So here we are 30 odd years later, and Mr. Reagan's, trust but verify is still the best model, right?
It's a good model. It works.
Gotcha. So, and I know that it's hard to prognosticate, especially in the government business. So I'm assuming that, DCMA and DIBCAC's role, like you said, is going to evolve as CMMC replaces 800-171. Any last thoughts on that topic?
DCMA will continue to be a part of the valued member team that is known as the umbrella of CMMC. So if you think about it, we will always be there. We're kind of like a bad penny. We just keep turning up.
Well, I mean, your job is to manage contracts and validating that people are conforming with the contract requirement. So obviously you need to be. You're definitely the umbrella for sure. And then it'll be. I think the interesting one will be is what is DIBCAC's role? How does DIBCAC's role evolve? A little bit. It's going to be fun to see.
I agree. I want to foot stomp something really, and I can't say this strongly enough. CMMC brings a lot of value to the table, and it's something that has been needed from day one. We talked a little bit about 7012 earlier. It started out as this. Yes, it was a mandatory requirement, but really nobody was checking it. There was no hammer. There was no meat. There was nothing to really force compliance. Even though it's a mandatory requirement, I actually had a company one time in a public forum tell me that, hey, we know this requirement's on our contracts and we have absolutely no interest in doing anything with it until we know somebody's going to come look at us. At which point
they said that to the DCMA.
They said that point blank to my face. It became an interesting conversation at that point.
Yeah, I would not have liked to have been the person who was dumb enough to say that.
but there are companies that, I mean, I'm not trying to cast aspersion,
Listen,
but it's a reality. It's a reality.
Not only that, John, not only was it a reality with the people, right? Because I've had people that literally say, I'd rather go out of business than spend the money, or I would go out of business. I'm just going to sign the letter. And they've sent the letter in that says that they're attesting. And I've literally had other people tell me that the prime said to them, just send us a letter that says you're doing it, whether or not you are or not. We need to paper our file. So yeah, I think I absolutely have seen it many times myself. So yeah, but I think it's been the guilt of both parties, right? It's the people that are willing to sign something that they didn't do, and then right. I think you've got some of the primes, or have not done a good job of really any level of diligence.
I would agree. Here's the one thing I will tell you, and this is the part that I find relatively amusing with this whole conversation. So I'm a geek. I don't know if you can see behind me, my home server is sitting right behind me. You can't see the other workstations around me. The equivalent of 800/171 is all around me. It cost me, well, where it's downstairs. My UB key is downstairs. Mm-hmm. The requirements that 800/171 puts on the table are so minimal. Now, granted, if you're a big company and you got to buy a lot of CAT cards, or you got to buy a lot of security tokens, it does get expensive, mm-hmm. and it becomes complicated in how you manage it. But if you compare that to the work that you're performing, that you're trying to protect, and you're trying to ensure that you're not sharing your information with your competitors, whether they're good guys or bad guys, is irrelevant. Those requirements represent the bare basic things that you would hope a company is doing to protect its own proprietary information, let alone the CUI information that the government is interested in.
No, I agree.
So when I hear companies complain about these arduous requirements, I just ask them, hey, so when are you going to disconnect from the internet? Because that's the only way, if you don't do these basic things, that you're going to protect yourselves.
No, I agree with you.
And of course, nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, no, if you look at, I always tell people, if you look at, 800-171, you look at CMMC level 3, I'm a fan of it, and the reason I'm a fan of it is it follows good basic fundamental information security paradigm, yes. Right? It's understand your scope, understand your risks, and put controls in place that are proportional to risk. And I don't think there's anything in there that a company that was protecting intellectual property wouldn't have logically put in place that you're asking for to protect CUI. In fact, like we do a lot of work with ISO 27001 and SOC 2 and high trust and FedRAMP. All of those requirements largely require the same level of due diligence, right?
Yes.
Authenticate and authorize users, generate logs so you can identify and respond to incidents. Fundamentally, it's great security. So I agree with you. I don't think you've created I think the bar is appropriate.
I do too, and I think that the CMMC is the logical evolution of that baseline, because what CMMC allows us to do is hold companies more accountable in advance to awarding contracts. Mm-hmm. The basic 7012 clause was based on a trust me self-attestation. We've made some adjustments. We're conducting some assessments. Quite honestly, from a resource perspective, even if I had unlimited time and dollars and could hire every cyber professional, in the U.S. government, I still wouldn't have enough resources to go out and look at 300,000 companies, in a normal lifespan. So having this methodology where it's a contractual requirement just to do the work, that helps address a serious shortcoming of the previous implementation. The CMMC team that Katie Arrington, Stacy Bushjanik, and all of the folks on the AB and the government, service and agency partners that have worked together to put that together, that has been a massive undertaking. It's been highly successful.
Yep.
It's something that is needed. We need that ability to ensure that companies take this stuff seriously, because we all see the headlines. You see them, I see them. Everybody in TV land sees them. It is real. Every day stuff is walking out the door that we didn't intend. We have seen We have seen companies doing really, really great work. We've seen companies doing really, really not so great work. And CMMC should help us with that going forward because it raises the bar to a point where companies need to certify that they're able to do the work before they're awarded those contracts.
Yep.
We don't have that means right now, and I look forward to having that additional oomph, if you will, behind the standard.
I agree completely. I mean, look, it's a matter of national defense, and it's a matter of our national economy. I mean, when you look, you talked about $8 trillion. I don't know what percentage of the GDP it is, but it's a pretty big percentage, right? So it's critical to us. So we've done a pretty good job here of covering a lot of ground. Is there any questions that you get asked all the time that we didn't cover yet?
Now, the biggest one is, should I stop doing what I'm doing now? But I think we've covered that.
Yeah, the answer is no, never.
No.
With a capital N.
It's pretty amazing how often that comes up in these sorts of forums.
Yeah, I know. So we forgot to send you over the questionnaire. So there was one question, the agenda for the podcast ahead of time. So, I don't know if you remember. So, we have that question, the amazing or horrible CISO. We asked the question, what fictional character, real person you think would make an amazing or horrible, information security director, a DIBCAC auditor? We can use whatever you want. You want to take a stab at it, or you want to leave it out now because we didn't give you the time to prep?
Well, I may be dating myself, but you ever remember the cartoon character of Snidely Whiplash?
Oh my gosh. I mean, yes. I mean, my grandparents told me about Snidely Whiplash. I couldn't have possibly be old enough to remember that.
Boris and Natasha would also be a great.
Oh, I love Boris and Natasha. Yeah, that's the Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Either of those would be fair representations of what you're looking for.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And why?
You got to.
Let's go with Natasha. Let's go with Natasha and Boris because I like that answer the best.
You got to almost be an evil genius to think through how some of this stuff needs to how it needs to work, and how it should be implemented and how it should perform. And I think Boris and Natasha capture that. And you got to have a sense of humor as well, because I'm telling you, we have seen things that on assessments that you just cannot imagine how humorous they can be. My personal favorite is talking about the difference between mobile devices and mobile code. Two very different things, but sometimes they get smushed together.
Yeah. So you're an auditor. I'm an auditor. I've done a lot of audits over the years, and one of my favorite stories is the same kind of thing where we were doing an audit of an organization, and the guy was floundering horribly, and he couldn't answer any questions, and he really started to get all sweaty and everything. And finally, I said to him, do you guys run an IDS? And of course, I was referring to network intrusion detection, and he was like, yes, it's Simply Safe. He's referring to, and he was so excited, and I almost didn't have the heart to tell him. And I finally went, I meant network IDS. He's like, I don't know what that is. And I was like, okay. And he was back into his flop sweats. All right. So last question. If anybody had a question for the DCMA or for the DIBCAC, what's the right place for them to find those answers?
So that's a good question. The best answer would be to reach out to somebody like me. Mm-hmm. We don't put our assessment information on a publicly accessible website for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. We don't share details of results for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. So if anybody wants to get a hold of me, my email address is john.a.ellis.civ@mail.mil. Shoot me an email. I will respond, or I will pass the question to somebody way smarter or better looking than me to answer the question.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to go a little bit to find either one of those, John. So
well, I don't know about that.
Well, you were pretty nice to me so far today, so at least I could do is throw a couple bouquets back the other way. So listen, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. I genuinely appreciate it. You addressed a couple of questions, that so many of the people that we chat with every day, and you've made my job easier because now it's funny, like right now with so much uncertainty, people want to know that your opinions are founded, right? That you've got a basis for your opinions, like an auditor. So
Right.
thank you for giving me a basis for my opinions.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And as always, we're here to serve. If anybody ever has questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will do our best to answer the question. I'm one of those guys. I'll answer just about any question you ask me. And if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know, and we'll go find the answer and get it back to everybody. Because believe it or not, I'm a firm believer we're all in this together. And if our DIB partners are successful, we are as well.
It's funny because everybody preaches the same thing from the top on down with you guys, which is really great to hear. I mean, look, everybody's really truly committed to this. So great stuff. Again, thank you, sir.
Anytime.